Welcome, friends and comrades. Today we have a guest lecture from Professor Farhang Erfani at American University on the 1990 film called Close Up by the Iranian film director Abbas Kiarostami. Close Up is considered by many critics to be amongst one of the most important films of the 20th century, if not of all time. It tells the story of a lower class Iranian by the name of Sabzian, who poses as a famous film director in Iran. He is then brought into trial with witnesses, including all of his friends and family. And the film ends with a grand reunion between Sabzian and the film director himself. This film has been analyzed from numerous angles by film theory. In today's presentation, we apply the thought of Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, to unravel theories of desire and of the gaze in the film. Joan Kopjak is so moved by Abbas Kiarostami's work that she has, for the last 20 years, studied his films and Lacanian theory, as well as Sufism. And we are hosting a symposium on Joan's new book, which is called Cloud. And if you pause the screen here, you can take the QR code to RSVP for a public symposium we're going to hold with Kopjak on August 19th. All right. Hope you enjoy the presentation. All right. Welcome back, friends and comrades. Very pleased to introduce Farhang Erfani, a philosopher, American University, a figure who actually introduced me, one of the first teachers of Lacan many years ago when I was studying at AU. And I'll never forget walking to the library with Farhang one day where he said, I'm not a full Lacanian, I'm a Sartrean. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, in social activities, Lacanians tend to not be as easy to be around as Sartreans. And he, and then it was a very insightful point about community and philosophy at that moment. I suppose the problem being that there's not a huge community of Sartreans anymore, although maybe we could do something about that. But here we are. Thank you all for being with us. We're going to turn the floor to Farhang in a moment to discuss an essay that he wrote in a book called Iranian Cinema and Philosophy, Shooting Truth, published in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. The essay in question is entitled Regarding You, Lacanian Ethics and Kiarostami's Close-Up. So this is film theory in Lacan. It is a look at Abbas Kiarostami, the great auteur, Iranian filmmaker, and his fascinating 1990 film Close Up, which I'm going to refrain from commenting on until we hear from Farhang about this incredible film. Farhang, welcome. The floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. I I remember something of that conversation vaguely about Sartre. Um, what I always like about being a Sartrean is there is no pretense of being dogmatic or saying Sartre was always right because he was so wrong about so many things so often, and nobody can defend him fully. So it gives you a little bit more freedom. And Lacanians sometimes become very dogmatic about some of his teachings. But over the years, I've made my peace with being a Lacanian too, I guess, at this point, having written enough about him. I want to thank you, Daniel. I love your series. I follow the podcast a lot, and I look forward to talking to Joan again. For today, it's rare to have a chance to talk about both a film that people know and also Lacan that people know. It's usually one or the other. And I want to cover some of the basics that I think are there for Lacan in that movie. But I also have some questions about Lacan and film theory that, in some ways, I want to brainstorm with you guys because I'm stuck. I don't know the answer to it at all at this point. I've been thinking about it a lot about Lacan and film theory, and I have some criticism that I can't figure out on my own. So that's going to be the exciting part part for me. But I think before anything else, I should just briefly explain just a tad bit of what Iranian cinema is like. And Kiarostami is probably still the biggest name we have. There are many big names these days, but he had the longest career, the most prolific career, very well rewarded. And this movie has made some recent top 100 movies ever made. Another category called it one of the top 50 ever made. It's it's been quite a it's been a point of fame for him, but it's a movie that he struggled with himself because it was getting out of control in some ways. And control is the issue with all Iranian cinema after the revolution. And I think that's an important aspect in order to understand Kiarostami's influence on the rest of Iranian cinema, but also the context in which he worked. He was already a director before the revolution, and he made some very good kind of artistic art films, the way some of his other works are. But of course, most of his work happened after the Iranian Revolution. So let me put him aside for a second. The Iranian Revolution, the first theocracy ever that managed to maintain power for the last 40 years, despite, I say the first theocracy and the only one that has actually ever worked. The Taliban come close, but they never have had the same control over Afghanistan the way Iran has full control over the country. And also, they are very much still figuring out their own dogmas as they go. The Iranian system has been more established. Afghans, Talibans have a much simpler relationship with representation. They just don't like it. They bury TVs, they destroy it, they don't like films, they don't like representation. They avoid it. And and in Islam, certainly representation is complicated because you can't represent Muhammad ever as a face. In few movies where he is sort of a character, there's this old one from Hollywood called The Messenger from the 70s, where it's full of all big Hollywood actors, including Anthony Quinn, who's constantly talking to Muhammad, but he's just facing the camera and just talking, and you don't hear Muhammad talk. So Muhammad can't be represented. And representation, therefore, seems obviously a bad thing for Shiite theology. But Khomeini, the, the founder of this theocracy, he did not think that he could ban outright movies. He was tempted. We know enough about his dialogues with his people surrounding him. But Iran had already a culture of cinemas. It had a lot of movies produced, and he didn't think he could come out outright and ban it. But what he thought he could do was to suffocate it in some ways. And Iranian cinema deal with some of the worst censorship possible, as in anything that is made has to be officially approved by the censors before it gets aired. They have gotten slightly at times more generous, but at times they're so dramatic you can't completely predict what they're going to do either. So, what does it mean concretely, and what does it do for representation? I think this is where Kiarostami has always had the easiest time, and he has led this movement of showing that representation is more complicated than the censors realize. In the case of Close Up, almost everybody involved, actually, yeah, everybody involved was already part of the story. They are self representing, or they are representing a story, And this is part of the complexity of representation with Lacan I want to get to later too. But when normal actors act, there are two ways I can show you how Iranian cinema is complicated. One of them is the story of what we call proxy actors. Their rules of representation are softer on children. Children can have a little bit more leeway as to how they behave on screen. They're still restricted, of course, as to what they say, they represent, etc. But it's not like male and female adults, where the woman is always veiled and is oppressed very visibly. Iranian cinema has often used children in order to depict adult stories because it's easier. It circumvents a lot of the complexities of, well, adults shouldn't be talking this way. Adults shouldn't be worried about these things. But what that does is that children end up with outsized problems for children to face. So, because they're representing adult problems in society, but they're still children, it actually highlights those problems even more. This the life of Iranian cinema censorship is an entire story of things backfiring on them. When they don't want certain things represented on TV or on the silver screen, they end up having it represented indirectly, but in a way that highlights it more. Children is one of them. Another one that's fascinating always is the relationship between man and woman. Khomeini actually used a discourse that in the 70s, 80s sounded very familiar to Western feminists. He literally talked about the gaze, the male gaze on women's bodies. And he was saying we want to prevent that kind of voyeuristic, Western, objectifying gaze that looks at women as just naked objects or semi naked objects on screen. So he instead wanted them covered. If a woman goes out, certainly before the current pushback, but typically you know that there's the hijab laws you have to cover. That has been a contentious issue forever, especially since the Mahsa Amini woman life freedom protest has been very much centered on that. But at least when you go home, you can take it off. But Iranian cinema, when they depict a husband and wife on screen, when they go inside the house, the woman still has the veil on because it is representing her outside, even though it's inside, which actually makes the veil even more bizarre because it doesn't belong there. In many scenes, you see the woman actually lie down in bed with it. I had a very devout grandmother who would never be caught without her veil if there was anybody she didn't know around her. She would never sleep with it. If she wanted to take a nap, even she would take it off. Like there is no consistency to that. Nobody would ever do that. Yet, because they force it, they actually bring the absurdity of their own grip on women on screen. These tensions are constant in Iranian cinema. And the last one, again, about men and women that I always find fascinating is that they don't want intimacy. Certainly nothing like intimacy as we understand it, almost anything sexual, but they don't want even soft touches between husband and wife. So when you have a husband and you have a wife on screen, let's say the wife is sick and the husband can't touch her, can't comfort her by touching her. So, what kind of story, what kind of script, what kind of narrative can you have where there is a sick woman in the house and the husband won't touch her? Well, you have to have one kind of a real patriarch asshole of a husband who just yells at her as opposed to touch her. So, in so many ways, many of the roles that in between men and women played on screen keep highlighting a very aggressive, nasty patriarchy, because the censors don't want them to touch each other. So it makes more sense to make them act antagonistic to each other. So there's a whole story, there's a whole history of this difficult relationship with representation. Kiarostami just took it to a whole different level. What he did in close up, he did it frequently. He would often read about a story, he would find it fascinating. He would go back and ask the people to reenact. And his constant reenactment, as anybody who knows anything about Kiarostami knows, blurred the lines between documentary and fiction, between reenactment or how much of it is it actually faithfully reenacted? How truthful is it? Is it fiction? Is it not? Um, Hamid Dabashi, in his new book on Kiarostami, he calls it factasy, like facts and fantasy mixed together at this point with Kiarostami, because you can't tell them apart very frequently, because he is both the most obnoxiously auteur like, as in a complete control freak of everything. And at the same time, he's the opposite too. He lets so many things happen that he doesn't know where they're gonna go. He goes back and forth between the two. There are many things he absolutely clearly controls fully, but there are other parts that he lets his actors improvise. He himself improvises. He doesn't know where it's going. We know this from many interviews and uh, his own speeches. So that's he complicates that. But he broke the fourth wall more than anybody else too. You see that with close up, where at the beginning you already have this character in prison, and you see Kiarostami from the back talking to him. He makes that kind of a Hitchcock movie. For a moment you just see him, but he disappears quickly. But his voice persists, which on the Graph of Desire, voice is always so important too, because he dictates the pace. At this, while he's saying that, look, I'm just here to get the story reenacted, he tells the judge, can you move the trial by 2 weeks because of my schedule? And the judge agrees, because it's Kiarostami, so of course he's going to agree. But you see what I mean? He controls even the judge's schedule. Yet he says, I'm just letting these people tell their own story. He won't ever let you catch him. And that has everything to do with the gaze and desire, obviously. And I'll get to that a little bit more in detail in a second. But I want to also say that his complexity with film is always apparent even in the texture of the film. Between 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter, the way he has grainy scenes inside the court when he's talking to Sabzian, he always plays with this texture. He wants sometimes to bring something that is so close to you that it looks textured. You see the grains of it directly. And then when he wants to change that perspective, he uses a wide lens and a 35 millimeter to give you a much wider range, which is why he told Sabzian, he said, whatever you want to tell the truth, you go to this close up camera. As in, he's telling that there is a way that you can break not just the fourth wall, but just the symbolic wall. As in, I will give you access to your truth. I will get you a way to speak that in a normal rest of the movie you won't be able to speak. And he does that frequently. There is one of his famous movies that he made that made him famous was called "Where Is My Friend's Home," which is again a story he read about, that there was a poor little kid who was behind in basically his homework and had a very strict, nasty teacher, and he had to get his notes his from another friend, but they were all in rural areas of Iran. So this kid basically goes from village to village asking for his friend. And it's a very simple, heartfelt, kind of tragic. You feel for the kid as he's trying to satisfy the adult authorities. When Kiarostami made this film, it was fairly well received. Then in the same area where that happened, also in 1990, that's why he's so busy, there was a major earthquake. Kiarostami went up there to look for the same kid because he was worried about him. And as he was looking for the kid, he saw all kinds of humanity, all forms of life that are basically trying to deal with the aftermath of an earthquake. And he loved it so much that he brought his crew and asked everybody to reenact their lives as they were facing a tragedy within 48 hours of it. He asked them to revisit the site of trauma. And so people would go to it. That's something he often did. And the willingness of people to participate in it is absolutely incredible. That movie is called Life Goes On. And the life goes on is because at some point he runs into somebody who's holding, basically tweaking an TV antenna, and he asks him, "What are you doing?" And the guy is like, "I'm trying to fix the TV antenna. The World Cup is on." And Kiarostami himself had a bad reaction, was kind of scolding him. And the guy said, "Yeah, I lost everybody in my family, but I have the rest of my life to mourn, but the World Cup is on now. I can't miss that." And Kiarostami thought it's incredible. So he asked him to reenact that. And while Life Goes On was the movie, he has a third version of it called Through the Olive Tree. Because when he was there, he was asking the locals to help him make this movie about the earthquake. And apparently, in the background, there was a kind of a courting. One guy who was desperate trying to get the woman to agree to marry him, and she didn't want to. And he didn't realize this was happening in his own crew. Once he realized it, he came back and turned the cameras back on himself one more time. So the third version is a, is based on his own crew, and it's again a true story. But at the same time, at what point can you say it's a true story? It's a very, very difficult measure with him to pinpoint what would be true. Part of what I find so fascinating, as I said, I want to talk about the representation issue. The interesting part that I didn't talk about in my book because I didn't think about it back then at all is to is the similarity of what happens in the clinic. We reenact things with the analyst. We have to revisit stories, and there is the replaying of the roles. I'm not talking about those simplistic role play, but the way the analyst represents the symbolic, and you have to bring yourself back to the kernel of the trauma. Kiarostami does that a lot. So to put the question that bugs me already on the table is that as much as I see so many similarities, starting with the clinical setting, in no other film has it come close to maybe working, but I am actually I find the Lacanian film theory problematic in the following way. And I wrote, you saw my own chapter, I did it myself, so I'm not exempt from this issue. The issue that I have is that the Lacanian triad of the other, the analysant, and the analyst, there is a triad always present in the room. So when we talk about facing one's desire, and I'm going to do that with this movie, when we talk about traversing your fantasy, we use a lot of those terminologies that Lacan has, but we always do it in a way that is bizarre to me with film theory, as in, are we saying that Kiarostami is the analyst at this point? And with him, it's so close at times that it looks like he's trying to make you think about your own thoughts, your own desire, especially in this movie. But generally speaking, there is a bizarre approach we have that we use Lacan's concepts of gaze, desire, the symbolic, the imaginary, but all of Lacan's work was grounded in a praxis that required the analyst there with you. And in the absence of the analyst, how much is that really fruitfully Lacanian if the analyst is not there to interrupt you, to disrupt you. Kiarostami certainly does plenty of disruptions. He has his own scansion. He cuts the audio. He cuts the video. He constantly disrupts you. He's actually the closest I've seen to somebody trying to do something like the analyst, as in disrupt, not let you be in control. But at the same time, I want to have that conversation, hopefully in the discussion, about what are we doing when we have Lacanian theory applied to film when we don't have the analyst present, and do we want to dare to give directors the role of the analyst? That seems very suspicious. And many of those directors, I would never want them as analysts either. So something about this movie, I take it most. May I have at least one of those fake shows of hand? How many people don't know the movie? How much I need to give a background? Has everybody here watched it once? That's awesome. That simplifies the task enormously. Enormously. So we can actually get to the concepts quickly. The first thing about the gaze, the reason I was focusing on it, it's not just that the movie's called Close Up. It's that it seemed to me that that notion of the gaze in the Lacanian sense was perfectly present in this at multiple levels. At the very least, you had the gaze with Sabzion, the gaze with the family, and the gaze with us, the audience. You could definitely go deeper than that. You could start looking at some of the relationship with the judge as the symbolic authority, certainly. You could have the gaze of the other participants in it, the taxi driver at first, the very first scenes where they're going to arrest this guy. Apparently, those were the actual soldiers who arrested him. That was the taxi they had taken. They reenacted a scene in which the taxi driver started by saying, "Oh, I don't know movies," which by that point he must have known what they were talking about because they asked him to come back to the movie. But he supposedly at that point initially said, "I don't know anything about movies. I just deal with reality." And then what he did, and this is immediately Kiarostami is telling you that I'm not going to let you control this narrative, is that they go in to arrest this man, and yet we hit the wall, literally. Kiarostami stays outside with the taxi driver, and just we have this amazing scene where he's just busy and he picks some flowers. He tries to make a little bouquet for himself, and there's that scene that so many people have analyzed where he kicks a can down the road. Do you all remember at the beginning? It lasts an uncomfortably long time. It's about 35 seconds or so. It's actually a bug spray too, which makes it even better. So the gaze could be present at so many levels, but the reason I liked it is because on Twitter, on social media, it's now part of nearly ordinary language for people to talk about the male gaze. And so much of the gaze before Joan Kupchak basically just told everybody to sit down and listen, there was an enormous body of literature in film theory, all based on the notion of the gaze, meaning that the spectator is the gaze. So the male gaze would be the woman on the screen, and the male and playing the role for the male gaze. Now, I don't think John would disagree that that is an issue, and certainly it is an issue. The male gaze, the way that there's gratuitous nudity, there's all the different ways in which we are placed as spectators within that patriarchal role that we have to sort of project it onto the screen. That male gaze is something, but it's not Lacanian. The Lacanian gaze talking about this can is that Lacan had his own famous story about it, where he was as a young man near the sea, and all these fishermen were looking at this little fancy guy coming from Paris, pretending to be connecting with nature. And he saw this can, the tuna can, basically in the water. And one of the guys told him, "You see that can? It's looking at you." What does that mean? In Lacanian terms, when he says that the can is gazing at you, is that Lacan was there pretending to be connecting with nature, being out there talking to the proletariat, being close to the to reality and so forth, but he didn't belong there. He wanted to fit in, but he didn't, and he couldn't. And what the guy told him was that the whole thing is gazing at you, that can is gazing at you. It's telling him that the gaze is about your own desire. It's a mirror of your own desire, and it shows you the real of your desire that you're not easily going to face. So the real of desire here in this movie, Sabzian controls it for most of it. For most of the time, he seems to actually enjoy reminding people, the family, that look, you pin all of this on me, but let's be real, you wanted this. You fell for it. You went along with it. I love that one of the at first the family makes it sound like, oh, we kind of knew right away. But if you did, then why did you go along with it? Obviously you didn't. Or if you did, you hid it from yourself. So that's the real too. So this remains, and Zizek is very good at doing this, showing you that the gaze is about a stain, something that's supposed to be perfect and pristine. And Sabzion becomes the stain that looks back. He becomes the symbol that looks back at this symbolic authority, at society at large, that's looking at him, but he's saying, look at me all you want, but I represent your own lack, the real of your own desire. And there's a smile he has that clearly he's enjoying doing that too. Of course, he faces the real of his own desire at the end when he meets the real Makhmalbaf, who's right there when he comes out of prison, and he literally falls apart when he has to face his own desire as well. And he comes the closest to literally holding his desire as Makhmalbaf is riding with him on the bicycle, on the motorcycle. Sorry, I should. I don't know if everybody looked what the story of the cyclist was, the one that Sabzion pretended to have written. He doesn't look all that much like Makhmalbaf, but enough, I guess, that in his own imaginary mirror image, he could imagine himself being like him, being successful like him. And he clearly identified so much with that fantasy without imposing it on others because he was carrying basically the script, the printed script, with him in the bus. When the mother of the family saw that script and he said, "Here you go, you can have it," and he signed it, autographed it, I think that's the height of his desire at that moment. As in, for a moment here, I was Makhmalbaf, and it's no harm done, really. I just gave him a gift. But the mother wouldn't let go. She said, "You have to meet my kids who want to be actors." The more they drag him in, the more they let him represent their desire, and the more their desire was clunky, the more their desire was not working, the angrier they became. Ultimately, at the end of the movie, or in the court, the family basically agrees to withdraw their their complaint against him because now they have to. they're going to be ridiculed in some ways if they keep insisting on this. What they were trying to do with justice, with the symbolic, was to cover their own mistake. So it wasn't them, it was a con man's fault. It's not that they were participants. It's not that they wanted this so bad that they allowed him to be part of their lives for a few days. It had to be that the symbolic would give him the stamp of approval that, yes, officially this is a con man and you are not. You are not, you are innocent of anything symbolically. And they played the grand gesture of letting him go. But throughout this whole thing, whether it's the gaze of society at large on Makhmalbov, because Makhmalbov is there as a haunting figure throughout this whole thing. And this is an important aspect. I started talking about how Kiarostami is good at evading censorship, and he was a genius at it. But a lot of people wanted him to have more politically charged movies, and he never did it. He refused to be that kind of committed, politically driven messenger. His movies still disrupt the entire symbolic order, always, but not for the sake of politics alone. Whereas Makhmalbov, the guy that he was pretending to be like him, he always made movies with a lot of political oomph in it. He wanted to show things. And the cyclist, the story of it, if you don't know it, just in a couple of lines, it's amazing, is the story of how Afghan refugees are mistreated in Iran. If you follow some of the news recently, again, there is an expulsion of Afghans and mistreatment of it. It's the greatest stain to me on our societal shortfall these days. But Afghans have been mistreated in Iran for a long time. They go to Iran because it's the same language or close enough that they can hope to find some jobs. And once they're there, they never fit in and they don't have access to societal symbolic capital. So there's the story of the cyclist is the story of one poor worker whose wife was very sick and he needed to pay a lot of money for her at the hospital and he had nothing to offer but his body in that materialist sense of the laborer just laboring, offering his body for wages. But no matter what he would do, those wages would never be enough. So when he was trying to find a way to make money, ultimately it became known that he was a good cyclist back at home. And they created basically a betting game inside a large square, like a private area. He said that he would ride his bicycle day and night for 7 days, which is physically impossible, but and people would bet on when he would fall. And that became the game of the cycle. The whole cyclist movie is about this poor guy going around and all of these people, including the police officer who get in on the betting. They figured out that this is kind of fun, so they also start betting. The entire society collapses all of its morality in order to enjoy the suffering of this poor guy. So Makhmalbov did indeed show suffering. And this is why Sabzian keeps saying, I want my suffering to be known the way Makhmalbov shows it. I am also marginalized, different than the Afghan refugee, but I want it shown. And at the end of that movie, by the way, he actually makes it in some ways with some incidents, but he they can't even stop him at the end. He keeps pedaling, going in a circle. They all tell him, you won, but he has lost all of his humanity in that process. There's nothing left other than a pedal for him. What you get from Makhmalbaf is this committed, engaged, politically savvy way of dealing with the margins of society. And then you get the way Kiarostami whiffs off of him, because this movie also became about marginalization. It became about Sabzian being in the margins, being the one who needs help. And at the very end, when you have the ultimate conversation that the audience is dying to know, which is what is Makhmalbov talking to this guy about on that motorcycle? That's the moment that you hear Kiarostami's voice again, because allegedly the sound cuts off. So we don't hear the most important conversation. This is the moment where us as viewers, we are so committed to understanding what happened. And this is again the moment of the gaze for Kiarostami, as in cutting the audio off shows us that we needed that resolution for our own sake, because it's not about the poor guy and it's not really about Makhmalbov. And again, at the end, he leaves us at the wall. When he goes there, he again says, I'm Makhmalbov, even though the real one is right there. In order to apologize, he has his contrition, all of those things. But Kiarostami's gaze is a constant reflection back in a way that is absolutely amazing. Whether it's the family being forced to face their own desire, whether it's Sabzian himself who has to face it, us at the audience having it. I love the fact that even the judge was kind of giddy to be on a film, because he kept saying this is not important, but then he agreed to it. And what Kiarostami told him, as in, I need to change your schedule, and he said yes, again showed that he's interested in this. He's playing along with it too. So it's not the typical male gaze, but it's a the entire movie to me is a game of the gaze, back and forth, showing how this one man brings about the real of desire in all of us when watching it. And I'm very curious to see how you experience it at watching. I just saw there were a whole bunch of comments I missed. Sorry. Um, but since there are many comments, Daniel, if it's all right, I'll stop here with this framing.
Absolutely. Um, Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I could kick us off with a couple of
Please.
points and questions. One is, you talk about the absence of the analyst, whether a what are the qualifications of a director to play the function of an analyst. I think clearly Kiarostami is, through the subtlety of his, because you have another chapter on Heidegger, and you say that really the absence of politics signifies poetry, that is a poetic intervention. And you say it's both scansion, but also punctuation. And punctuation in the context of free association of the analyst and in the clinic is actually different than scansion. And I wanted to invite you to talk about that distinction and maybe how that distinction works for Kiarostami. I feel that that's quite interesting. For example, probably the moment that's most important that is deprived to the viewer that you just described is a punctuation moment in a certain way. I also absolutely adore the family dialogue in the sense that um, they begin to question his authenticity of his voice as to whether he can ever not be acting. And you point out that in order for him to realize his desire, the only option available was transgression of the symbolic law. And in a way, he reveals, therefore, the truth of subjectivity, so to speak, as such. And that's the traumatic truth of Sabzian for others, for everyone involved, even these filmmakers that are involved in a certain way. He's upsetting their own desires, showing that they too rely on a transgression of the symbolic, which he had the courage to assume, and maybe they don't. Maybe they don't. And then, of course, the question regarding the social suffering and the cyclist. I mean, to me, I was struck by the way, and I mentioned this to you before, that the jurist, so-called the religious perspective of the film, seemed to have an unquestioning allegiance to the existing symbolic, the existing division of labor, and at all costs, irrespective as to whether those bourgeois film directors themselves may not be religious, they may be secular, probably they are. What
Uh-huh.
mattered was that they know their place, that everyone knows their place. And Sabzian is, he's disrupting that. And I think that's the most interesting part of the film to me, that disruptive act in a certain way, and also the compassion that we have for him. And I would be curious if others had that affect of like, oh my God, this man is speaking something which we, of course, because his mother gets up there and says, well, he was too poor, he was unemployed, he couldn't find work, etc. And then the question as to whether them going along with his lie, was that also a reflection of the fact that maybe in reality they were duped by him? Maybe actually they resent the fact that he did con them
Oh,
successfully, right? And he was successful. I would contend. That's
mhm.
my view. Did you think so too, or did you think that they were going along with him? It's very ambiguous, actually.
I think they definitely fell for it because they say that we knew, but then why would you go along with it? And if you were going along with it, why would you bring it to the courts?
Yeah,
Right? They needed a pound of flesh in order to feel whole again. They needed justice, the justice system, to tell them that you were wronged and therefore it's not on you. I think that going to the justice system is because they couldn't otherwise swallow this. It would have been easy in some ways for them to say, go away, this was embarrassing, we don't want anybody to know. But they themselves were having to digest that. To me, they went to the courts because they needed affirmation and something that Kiarostami was depriving him of in some ways. What I think was the most brutal part for them is to have to reenact the scenes in which they pretended they were duped, but now that they know he's fake, they still had to replay their own complicity in that. I think in that sense, he was making them face their own desire because they had to reenact it. The mother had to reenact it. All of them had to reenact having been fooled by him. And
yeah.
they can't make him sound like a very great genius deceiver, like an evil genius, because then they're dumb, right? This is why they have to constantly bring him down so that it's not something that remains a stain for them. It sort of changes it.
I,
Taking
I would I would say one thing, and then we'll go to Takin. If you look at the full graph, and we just got done studying the subversion of the subject, so for some of us it's somewhat familiar. I would invite us to look at the graph because I think that you could almost go from the first intervention of the symbolic up to the second intervention of the voice. The voice
absolutely,
is on the first top right. And you talked about a punctuating moment or even a scansion moment that Kiarostami makes here, but then at the end of the film, it's almost like the first part of the graph up to symbolic, and then the second one up to the facing of the reel of enjoyment of jouissance at the top. I was wondering if that would work for you, and also I was curious to see how you might actually walk us through the graph vis-a-vis close up. But
absolutely. I want to do that, but I think let me take
please,
technical and then I'll do that.
please,
I won't forget.
Okay, first of all, thank you. That was a very nice talk.
Thank you.
Um, and it was nice reading your chapter, although I skipped the part about the like the summary of the film. I hope it doesn't have anything juicy in there because I skipped it. It's very interesting. The last few things you said makes me notice how different of a reading we have because um, I like just now when we were talking about the like whether the family was aware of this or whether they were sort of completely duped. To me, the thing that complicates everything, and you also hinted at it yourself, is the fact that they agreed to create the movie. Like the creation of the film really complicates everything because like you said a bit earlier, you said during the court case, they're basically forced to drop charges out of shame, out of embarrassment, right?
Yeah.
But to me, making a film reenacting your duping is the most embarrassing thing. So I'm not sure where I
That's
stand
it.
on.
But
I'm
it
not,
shows
especially
how
especially
desperate they were to be on camera.
yes, well, that's the thing, right? It's complicated. I can't tell personally. I can't draw the line um, on whether they're really they're committed this strongly to avoiding shame or whether they love the camera this much. To me personally, the first time I watched the movie, I just saw a family that was so incredibly bored. They were so ennuyé, right? Like they were overtaken by a strong sense of ennui, and then they see Mahmoud Boff on the bus. You know how unbelievable is that? The mother discovers him on the bus. I personally, if I was asked to reenact that scene, I would throw myself out of a window. So it's incredible this movie even exists just from like a from the perspective of the actors.
I agree. And honestly, the fact that we don't know their exact motivation is not only pure Kiarostami, but also it's their issue. And Kiarostami doesn't give us resolutions or denouement. He doesn't untie these things for us. We never have perfect mastery of what happened. This is the thing that in philosophy of film or film theory, a lot of people say about like horror films, which is horror films are ways of trying to make sense of horror by just giving us a version of it that we can actually consume. And Kiarostami doesn't do that. I can't imagine him making a horror film. It'd be the most awkward thing because horror films are supposed to bring you a monster super close. So you have a sense that, okay, I get what this monster is like. Even though I'm not it, I still got very a close experience of it. And Kiarostami is just, he never lets us know what this family ultimately said because he lets them talk. I think the mother got away with it easily because she said, I did it for my kids. And as you know, that's like the easiest thing for an Iranian mother to say to absolve everything. I did it for my kids, so therefore I'm not guilty. It's their issue as such. Um, let me. Any other question before I talk about the graph because that obviously is something that Daniel made. Please go on.
Okay, sorry to talk again. I do have another question. I uh oh dear. Let me just remember. Sorry, 1 second. Um, oh, well, I've lost it. I'll ask it again when it comes back.
Okay, no problem. Anybody else? Clint, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Farhang. This is a really great talk. And I was, like I said in the chat, I was interested in what you're saying about scansion and punctuation, in terms of, how Kiarostami, plays with our expectations. But I wonder, in terms of like a cut or something, what we do, and this whole facticity thing, the documentary versus fiction and so on, the contingent, he didn't invent the names of, I think either you said this or in your book about what Makmambash's name means, like a weaver of silk, is that
Yeah,
right?
that's literally what his name
And
is.
Sabzian is green, and
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 the
then
families want to be ironclad solid, like
yeah,
the
yeah.
desire for solidity. And those are the
Okay,
actual names I've checked, so it's
yeah, it's too good, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's
it's too good.
truth is structured like a fiction. But I wonder about like so the final scene. So he's do you I mean, I guess the question is, did that mic cut out because it was a crappy mic? And he just didn't shoot, or he didn't want to shoot again, and so on and so forth, right? Because that's like an amazing cut that happens there that we never, and so it's like we don't find out, or Kiarostami doesn't find out, if whatever, you know, he could have asked him later, but we don't find out what they said to each other. And so I want to ask you about that and what's going on with that. Like, if you think it was actually just random like, because they had a shitty mic, or if actually that was his directorial kind of auteurist decision. And then, I mean, don't you think in a certain kind of way that there's, I want to see what you do with the graph, because what kind of role fantasy plays here? Fantasy versus desire, you know, the way Todd talks about it. So yeah, the mic and then fantasy, please.
There is zero chance to me that this was an accident.
Okay, yeah, okay, good.
This is what I mean is that he's the most control freak kind of director. He controls
Right,
so much,
right.
but at the same time, there are things he doesn't control. But that cannot be it. He would have redone it. He would have stopped all of Tehran's traffic to force them to go back and redo it if he wanted to. And his voice there being annoyed at the whole thing
Yeah.
makes it sound accidental, but he clearly didn't. And I think I think I mentioned the music that he used at that point in um, in the movie. It's the only time he uses music, and it's the piece of music from his own earlier films, The Traveler or The Passenger, depending on translation, which was another similar kind of issue of facing your own about being a con man. That one was a story of a little boy in the far from Tehran who was obsessed with soccer, as most
Right.
would be, and wanted to go see it, and was too poor, and he borrowed the camera, and he pretended to take portraits of people who would pay him, and he would say, I will develop the film later and get you this. So he faked taking photos of people, and this camera gave him enough money to go to Tehran, but then he got lost and fell asleep, and he missed the whole game. So Kiarostami has a history of dealing with con men who are trying to get through society, but there is a thickness to it. And I think that he adds the thickness with the cutoff audio, as in
Yeah.
he doesn't let us have the solution there. He doesn't tell us what exactly Makhmalbaf told him that it made it okay. And I mean, I wanted to hear that more than anything else. I wanted that scene for the whole movie, where this guy who's been dreaming of being Makhmalbaf literally holds his desire physically, and it's incredible.
Well, maybe it's subjective destitution at that point because he's
Yeah,
collapsing, right? He's
and he
lost.
did collapse right away, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
he
Thank you.
faced it himself at that point. I think, Daniel, if I is it okay for Takin? Please go ahead. You have your question.
Yeah, is it a good time, or were you
Yeah,
gonna?
absolutely.
Because it's gonna change the subject. Okay. So I wanted to ask you what you made of, because all this talk has been about like desire, obviously, like the desire to be Mahmoud Baf, and you spoke about like his sort of isolated commitment to his desire, with him reading the book on the bus on his own, stuff like this. I find that the ending of the movie complicates this again, because Kiarostami asks him like, "Oh, what would you like to be at, like in terms of film? Like, what would you do? You like the role of director?" And he says, "No, I like the role. I think the best role for me is the role of the actor." And I wonder if there's a sort of cynical determinism here behind this, the idea that the con man's desire is ultimately to be a con man, if one would think of an actor as a sort of con man, right? Um, so like he never, from the very beginning, he never desired to be Makhmalbaf even. And one could even think of it, when one watches a movie, does one really desire to be the director creating the movie? No one sees any part of the create. Do you know what I'm saying? There's a hard wall between
Oh, of
the
course.
end product and the artisan. So what do you think of this?
I think that him saying he wanted to act is again, a complicated relationship with his own desires because he pretended he wanted to direct, and we know that he did identify with Makhmagov as a director because Makhmagov doesn't play in his own films. He's not an actor in it. And he thought that if he is the actor, then he could represent his own suffering in a way that nobody else can. And he talked about it. He says, I need my story to be heard. I need to be, he has his own motivation for it, I guess, to be heard. But
And remember the words he used when the judge asked him. I found very interesting. He says, "The suffering of this social class is not heard." He also referred to himself as a social class, which I found very interesting. The other thing I wanted to invite you to throw on the table, in conjunction maybe with the graph, is actually the question of ethics, because you say, to quote you, that Kiarostami's art is Lacanian precisely because it refuses to cover up or veil lack, which is another way to understand the end scene of refusal in a certain way. And you have a rich discussion about Sabzian through Kiarostami. You quote Kiarostami saying why he likes Sabzian. It's very interesting because he says, I like him as a figure because he can make up beautiful lies better than the truth that others have. His lies reflect his inner reality better than the superficial truth that the other characters express, right? And Kiarostami says, I think it's the case that people's lies can draw you in closer and get a better understanding of them. So, what would this figure be if he's confronted with the figure he's trying to impersonate? In a way, it would ruin that. It would ruin the artistic genius of Sabzian, maybe, you know. But also, I want you to say something about ethics, given that it takes up a huge portion of your piece.
I think the ethical parts, especially within Lacanian framework, the earlier Lacan, this formula was being true to your desire, basically, and which in a more elaborate ways means you lack something, so you have to face the lack of your desire, which comes out more with the seminars on the gaze and the four concepts. I think it's a subject formation in this film, and it's the subject formation that is so complicated that none of the subjects are fully subjugated to our gaze. So none of them are subjugated to our understanding of it, but all of them are shown to be dealing with this fracture. One of my favorite um, scenes of it, going back to what Clint was mentioning, that ending. If I could show you just the screen of it, I won't even play it, is this one. There is no way Kiarostami could not have found a car that didn't have a broken windshield to have this shot, right? This is us behind the screen looking at it, and there is this frac just shattering right across the screen. He's forcing it. He's just constant, and it looked like a spider thing, right? And apparently Sabzian wanted to have his movie called The House of Spider. So he is playing with us clearly. He's playing with us, saying that the, the spectator's ethics here is one of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. I think the ethics of being true to your desire, it's that, Rolling Stone, I can't get no satisfaction. It's that admission that what we wanted out of this film and what we wanted out of Sabzian, and what Sabzian says, I am the class that won't give you that satisfaction, is that closing of the loop to fully explain why this man is who he is. And the ethics of it is to recognize the real, the kernel of the real in other people so that they're not your subjects, they are their own subject formation, struggling with their own real and with the same symbolic to some extent. So to me, the ethical injunction of it is for Kiarostami shows that you can master any of it, like including the shattered screen to me is right there, as in you. Not only the sound goes off, but even the screen itself is shattered. Let me about the desire and the graph. If I could, for me, the part that when I looked at my own chapter, which I hate doing, so I will never do that again. I didn't emphasize enough castration. I think that's the part that's in this movie is so important for all of them except Sabzian. Sabzian is the only one who's not afraid of castration. Because if we start with the graph of desire here at the end, the split subject, having a desire addressed to the other, that the other has to retroactively signify for you and bring it back so that you have an official role here. To me, the family thought that this is all it takes. As in, they had a desire to be recognized, they were wronged, and if this judge tells them you are officially wrong, then they have an official subject position that is no longer harmed, that is no longer split, as if it has fully covered it. But of course, the reason they wanted it is the lack in the other, as in they were seeking the objet A is right there, right? The objet petit a is fantasy. The subject with that little diamond, which according to Bruce Fink is the greater than and smaller than symbol put together that becomes a diamond. So the subject is never quite the same, can't ever be equal to the object of desire. Either it has more investment or doesn't get it. Sabzion, for them, as a fantasy will make sense. But the reason I say I didn't emphasize castration enough is that to me, when you address the other, so when you go from here to officially the other, and you address something, and your remainder desire literally goes over the head of the symbolic, the authority. As in, you do everything, and there is something remainder, some leftover, something that the symbolic failed to address, and that's left over becomes the desire. I think the fact that the first risk here is castration is so important because with castration, when it comes to these social stratification, especially, is that you have a desire that society doesn't account for, and you blame yourself, and you have the fear of being cast off. You have the fear of no longer fitting. You have the fear that there is something wrong with you. The fear of castration is the fear of being no longer part of society, and society can spit you out. And that's why instead of castration, you can go over its head to go back to the fantasy. As in, it's not that I don't want to be in society, I just want this thing. And the fantasy becomes the reason why you transgress, as opposed to your transgression being a risk of you being cast off from society. Fantasy allows you to have that justification to yourself. It heals you back because it's not just I'm a pervert weirdo that can't be part of society. Is that society just doesn't understand I need this one thing, this fantasy. And if I have it, then I'll be whole and I'll go back down the graph. But of course, the fantasy covers over the lack that you have. This is the lack of the ethical moment, as in you don't face the fact that you transgress, and it allows you to be soothed. It allows you to regain the function and you go back down the graph. Sabzion is the one who was withholding the reintegration into the symbolic, the lower part of the graph, the most. He's the one who was speaking from saying, I am the underclass, I'm the lumpen proletariat here, I'm the one that's you don't understand. So I'm already sort of cast off. And society, he had his own desires, certainly, but he becomes the symbol of your fantasy required me. Your fantasy required my presence. your fantasy required my pain. And without me, you wouldn't be able to go back down and be the good middle class people full of yourself that you are. And I think the families escaping castration is the most important one. And for us, obviously, as viewer, when it comes to film theory, castration is again not being able to figure something out and thinking that there's something that's not digestible. So fantasy always is the ability to reintegrate societal norms based on a reformulation of the lack in the other. And that's what Kiarostami and the graph to me is the most complicated one, and I didn't dare use him quite with the graph in that chapter because I don't think he lets you go back down with the fantasy. What he's asking you is to traverse the fantasy, which is to accept that there is something that you want that's not there. And if you face that, then you should be able to face your drive, which is the top of the graph. But he doesn't get us there. He doesn't fully get us there. I think he keeps us stuck in that portion of the graph more than getting us down back through it. That's how I would read it in terms of the graph. What do you think?
No, it's brilliant. In other words, there's not a confrontation with the jouissance at the heart of the social symbolic order. If anything, perhaps it's a disruptive, I don't know, gesture in which this fantasy is revealed as the stain that the tuna can that sustains the whole system is located. Um, but there's also like a it would be different if there wasn't a rapport discovered at the level of the legal apparatus, but there was, and it ends to some extent with the reintegration of a symbolic, albeit one in which there's this new knowledge inserted into it. So lack is sort of now having to be confronted or dealt with or something like that. I think that's interesting about the reading of Seminar 7 and the what Miller calls the paradigm of the heroism of lack, right? And I think perhaps this is not the only paradigm of ethics in the Lacanian discourse. And I wonder if there's other, I mean, Badiou is big in his book on ethics. I mean, he almost takes the heroism of lack, I would contend, as like the paragon of subjectivization of the militant subject, etc. Deleuze and Guattari will, of course, chastise this approach in a certain way. So I was wondering, in Lacanian, in the field of ethics, there's been quite a lot written that is critical of the ethics seminar. Do you, and now I'm moving away sort of from the specificities of the film, but I'm just curious what your appraisal is maybe of Lacanian ethics. Is there multiple ways of thinking about this notion of, because I mean, I think even this notion that Lacanian ethics is founded on a maxim of always staying true to one's desire itself is not accurate in a certain way or could be problematized. Do you see it that way? And what might you say about other ways of looking at ethics in the Lacanian register, out of curiosity? Does that make sense, first of all?
It really does. It really does because it's something that I've thought a lot about, and I definitely don't have a very clear answer. What I keep thinking about and going back to the structure of the clinic. So to me, the ethics has been so complicated because if we go back for 1 second to that graph one more time, and the way Zizek brilliantly basically introduced it to everyone and used it, but here's if you look at the graph in social terms of ideology, the way Zizek did it is brilliant, which is, let's say you are the split subject, you are, and to go back to that famous scene from Fight Club where you just do everything as told, uh, split subject, desire something, the symbolic said, okay, you're a boy. you get an official title. As a split subject of a boy, you go to school, you're told you need grades, you get those, you go back to another position. This split keeps remaining. You go to your job, you do your job, and you're still freaking alienated. So no matter what you do, there's always a leftover. And Zizek's brilliance was to say that by the time your split subject is bursting at the seam, that everything you have done right, there's still left over and there's still something lacking in societal arrangement. At this level of fantasy, instead of society this time telling you, okay, do something else, society tells you it's because of illegal immigrants that you're not getting satisfaction. That if only it weren't for them, you would be whole. You will no longer have that split. So that function is there in Lacan, that you could actually use fantasy in order to heal yourself. But Lacan, I don't see ever sanctioning this sort of societal blame, right? The ethics is not the ethics, it's the ethics of the self. It's the ethics of what you owe yourself in order to then be somebody with others. To me, the Lacanian ethics doesn't go very far and shouldn't go very far in terms of what you do with others. It's an ethics of being right with yourself. And being right with yourself has the coming to terms with your fantasy. And it's not just as simple as be true to your desire, because desire obviously is never going to be fulfilled, etc. The later Lacan, especially by seminar 28, 21, and 22, but by the symptom, he's fascinated by those who no longer need anybody, who can sort of tie it together themselves. But most of us tie our knots together via others, and others both being symbolic and other people. And it's one thing if we use it as an ideology, because that's a bad thing to say it's all immigrants' fault. But the fantasy in the Lacanian clinic is not always a bad thing. Whereas in the social function of it is generally a deflection. And I don't see it in Lacan's writing as a bad deflection when it comes to the clinical setting. As in, there is something of a coping mechanism with fantasy. And it's a coping mechanism that by itself is not wrong. But if, as a society, the lacks that we experience, we are told is blamed on some other part of the population, like the Afghan immigrants or the Mexicans here at the border, or whatever else is, who else is to be blamed for you not having full satisfaction, that's a huge gap between what Lacan said and the way we use it for politics. And I don't blame Lacan for it, because that wasn't his context. We just need to figure out what would it take to have the notion of fantasy that is not scapegoating. What would it look like to face society's shortcomings without scapegoating? Because you're demanding of the symbolic to face its own lack, which we know it can't do. There is no other to the other, as Lacan says. So if we don't have that, what does it mean as a society to do that? And that's where I don't have a good answer to this yet. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I've been reading the late Lacan to see in it, but I don't see it. To me, fantasy, if the fantasy of Sabzion stopped at the bus, in the bus right there, I don't think it would have been a huge problem. That was fantasy that Lacan would probably sanction. You would have to work through why you need to be Mahmalbaf in your head, but I don't think that that's the same thing as then jumping over and hijacking their fantasy in order to use it. I
Yeah,
think there's something that happens there.
and as you say, he does not portray an act. He does not portray a denouement. He does not portray an ethics of Antigone, right? Which
There's no
would
heroism. Yeah.
a gesture of a destruction of the symbolic, which would have a type of awareness of the lacking symbolic attached to drive beyond, a movement of a beyond. And it's in that movement of Antigone that I think radical communist politics has found a lot of sustenance from the Lacanian view of Seminar 7. And I agree that it's a beautiful point, and even Badiou's theory of the subject puts Antigone as this sort of paradigm of an ethics of the real, but that is premised on this drive insistence on an act which would exceed the laws of the symbolic
Yeah.
and all of that. And it's very interesting to think about this Lacanian notion of radical democracy as necessitating the construction of coalitions forged off of the emptiness of the socio-symbolic itself, right? That's almost the beginning point of the coalition, of the equivalential chain of, right? But still, nonetheless, there seems to be a struggle about how we think that through. And I know you've done actually quite a lot of work on Laclau, but he certainly comes to mind at that upper part of the graph, you
Yeah.
know?
If I may say something about Laclau that I think is fundamentally different, is that with agonistic politics, the way he has it, you're not covering over the real.
Mm.
When you have agonistic politics, you're actually trying to face societal shortcoming. You're not trying to say we are one whole if it weren't for this one issue.
Yeah, yeah.
You're saying that no matter what, we are going to have lacks in this society. And
Yes,
that's why it's
yes.
radical.
It's
And that's why we have to face it.
barred, big other, barred.
Exactly. And that's why we will never see eye to eye. We will never have a full reconciliation, the bar removed between us and the capital class.
Yeah.
Like when you have that acknowledgement, it's different than the Lacanian Žižekian approach, where you're looking at it in terms of, well, ideology is the thing. Ideology, of course, can cover over, but agonistic politics is different because it's trying to not shy away from the lack. It's trying to keep it alive, and then the coalition forming or the hegemonic formations are ways in which we can actually create new subject positions in a way that we all are facing a certain lack, so we can act on it. So Laclau goes in a different direction at some point politically. He doesn't get credit enough for that move, because to me, that's beyond Lacan. It's not just more of Lacan.
Fascinating. I want to invite Clint to jump in. You had a hand,
you had
please.
your hand.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This goes back to the earlier discussion of ethics and desire. I mean, and Todd McGowan in his introduction to Lacan, and I heard him talking about this on a podcast, but also it's in the book. He kind of sees Lacan as being quite Kantian there, right? In terms of the being true to your own desire. The only thing you can be guilty of is not giving ground relative to your desire. But something that Mary Rudy talks about in Distillations is really that for Lacan, there's a dialectic. There is that idea of one's own desire, and then there's desires that desire the other. And if we just stick with one of those things, if it's only your own desire, then that's the Rwandan genocide, as Danny Nobis talks about for Lacan's driver, or his African driver. Or it's if you just think desire is the desire of the other, then that seems to be a post-structuralist sort of notion of there's no subject. So to turn to our film, I think in some ways what Saspian show is that his desire is also very much this social desire. Everyone wants to be in pictures, right? And even the bourgeoisie, who are the failed bourgeoisie, because the son works at a bakery or something, right? They can't get jobs as engineers, which is an indictment of society, of not of those particular people. But nonetheless, everyone wants to be in pictures. The judge wants to be in pictures. Oh, he could be like in an Elmore Leonard novel. There's a little judge up there who's all excited about being in the middle of the wide shot. So Saspian's desire is the social desire, is that extimate desire, but he's also being true to his own desire. And I think in some ways that's where we end up with him saying, I think Takin pointed this out, that he wanted to be an actor. And so he was playing a director in his current comedy. Anyway, that's my way of thinking along this question of the ethics of desire in terms of what the film is helping us to think about.
Yeah, this is where it becomes complicated, where Sabzion in this film, where we end, versus, because we know that the actual man afterward was desperate to be. He spent the rest of his life trying to be a director and writing scripts
Oh,
and
right, yeah.
not getting picked up by anyone. You know, his mother right there, who was begging for mercy. He apparently used his entire inheritance from his mother to buy a camera in order to make films, and it didn't work. So I don't know if we should just stick to where he said in the film that he would only wants to act, and ignore the fact that we know he definitely wanted to also be a director. That's Kiarostami drives me up the wall, because you just can't figure out where Sabzion begins and ends, which Sabzion I'm talking about. So I think in the film it makes sense that he played the director, because he was playing a fantasy, right?
Yeah, sure.
So he was playing a director, and he played also the fantasy of being heard finally. Taki?
Just to add,
You're muted. You went on mute on accident.
Yeah, I can.
oh, sorry. Kiarostami mentions this factoid every time he talks about this film, because he's one of those guys who would repeat himself over and over. But he says that when he was making the film, he started losing his mind because no one would listen to his directions anymore. So there's this weird, again, like this film is just such a perfect conflation of reality and fiction, because in the film, this guy's like, "Oh, I want to be an actor," and then when you hear Kiarostami talk about the film itself, he's like, "My actors stopped being actors. No one was listening to me." And then Kiarostami's not a director anymore. The guy who's pretending to be a director, it's like such a mess in general. If you add like the outside of the film as well to it, so I just wanted to
No,
add that.
this is why I was saying he drives you up the wall. He doesn't give you satisfaction. You can never pinpoint him, and you can't pinpoint even his characters in that sense. But yeah, I heard he was apparently very. He was also very sad to hear that Sabzion afterward felt used by him. Sabzion felt that he didn't get his hearing to be heard. So that, I think the Sabzion post movie is the one who had to face more his desire of, okay, you got this, you became famous somewhat, and he hated the fame he got because that's not the fame he wanted. That's the kind of facing your fantasy. That's the kind of facing your desire and the ethics of it. But to me, this movie is one of the fewer complicated one where it feels like he's actually making you do the work of analysis. But generally speaking, I'm genuinely wondering why we are okay using so many Lacanian terminology and concepts when we don't have the analyst present and translate it so swiftly outside of the clinic. That's It's been haunting me recently a lot as a question.
On that point, I was wondering about that question. Are you suggesting that some films can adhere to the discourse of the analyst, whereas others maybe can't? And then if that's the case, what are the conditions for a film to, I don't know, resemble that? Or is that
It
itself
may
like a
well,
foolish proposition that we
yeah,
would
it
ever
may be
think?
too much, but this is why I was saying this is the one movie where I felt that function of my desire just like gazing back at me when I'm just getting so close to the screen, hoping to hear what Makhmalbov tells him on that motorcycle ride to figure out that, okay, now I understand the real Sabzian. Like there
Mm.
was that shattering experience of like this, literally the pain right there is shattered that he's showing us. I experienced it. I felt my own. He gazed back at me as in I needed satisfaction resolution to Sabzion that I wasn't getting. But so I don't know how far we can take it. I think there are movies that make you see the elements of the real. There are movies that allow you to experience many of these categories. But Lacan had a praxis, and I don't know how much that praxis translates. And as somebody was written on Lacanian film theory, I'm genuinely stuck. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know myself. That's a very interesting question. I mean, there's uh, the question regarding the subject supposed to know and the
Mm-hmm.
production of the subject supposed to
That's
know.
right.
Would that fall on the viewer? Uh, it's not clear to me either. There's also this sort of question that Gabriel Tupanamba has raised in his recent book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis, regarding what he almost refers to as the imperialism of the Lacanian interpretive theory of the signifier itself, where Lacanian social critique he claims gets too loose in its claims regarding the efficacy of I don't know interpretation, which is extracting from conditions of free association developed in the clinic and then sort of
I
surreptitiously
think,
applying that to the symbolic or to society as if society could be a relevant stand-in for the conditions of free association. But as you know, when you speak in analysis, the whole premise is that you're speaking to a site in which there's already an operation on the otherness that one is speaking to that has been forfeited or shut down, precisely so you can almost speak to and invent a new field of otherness.
yeah,
So I agree with you that that's perhaps a conundrum of Lacanian film theory that maybe has not been examined enough. Maybe Joan will have some thoughts on that for us
yeah.
next
I'm
week.
actually genuinely curious to see what you would do with that. But what was the reference? Can you send that to me because I didn't
Yeah,
know?
this is The Desire of Psychoanalysis, Exercises in Lacanian Thinking from Tupanamba, Northwestern University Press. Not the Short Circuit series, but the other one, Diaresis, with
Okay,
Adrian Johnston, Zizek as editors, came out in 2020, 2021 maybe.
okay. Thank
It's
you.
very good. We did a whole symposium on it. It's this
I need
wider
to.
theory he has called Lacanian ideology, where he tracks the debate between Badiou and Miller in the Cahiers pour Analyse over suture from like the 60s. And he argues that Miller effectively invents this uh, Lacanian ideology, which sort of tries to make the claim that certain logics derived from the clinic can have a kind of easy application to social political matters.
Oh,
Uh,
I love that. I need to read that.
it's
I
very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it really, I think, made Zizek question a lot of things. He wrote the foreword to it precisely because Zizek's probably the biggest culprit of that precise
yeah,
operation, right?
yeah. And you and I have talked about it years ago, where I told you that to me, when we take Lacan outside of certain contexts politically, especially in post-colonial context, that if you remember, I was working on the theory of that you end up having the law of the father and the law of the stepfather. Basically, to me, the other father, the imperial father, that it just splits the subject in ways that typical Lacanian theory does not account for.
Well, I want to invite other comrades to jump in with any thoughts,
Yeah,
clarifications, comments. I put 8:30, so we're technically a little over, but of course we have more time if folks want to
yeah, I'm okay.
jump in. We have a little more time, Farhang.
Absolutely, I'm here.
I also wanted to ask uh, if you could, because I've mentioned a little bit about your research in Derrida. Uh, would you mind sharing a bit about what your current work is in that area? Are you still working on Derrida right now?
I am. I've been rereading everything of his from scratch because I think the best way I can say it in a brief way is I think Derrida gets a pass too easily on being non-Eurocentric. I think part of it is the mystique of his Algerian background that's being used, but also he had a certain clarity about some of these European issues. But I think that's it's exaggerated. I think that there is a remnant of Eurocentrism in him, or at least what I want to call the limits of Eurodecentrism, if we want to call what he does as Euro non-centric or decentric. I think that decentering it is one thing, but it keeps it. And you see that discussion come up constantly outside of in the discourse, in post-colonial discourse, as to whether philosophy is copyrighted to the West, or if you use it outside of the West, are you selling out? Are you becoming the, black skin, white mask? As in, is it because it's not yours? Are you allowed to use it? And to me, philosophy should not be copyrighted by Europe, but it's a complicated discussion. So my work is just looking at everywhere where he's dealing with the limits of European thought when it comes to philosophy. And some parts he is very helpful, but some other parts he says disturbing things. That the worst one to me is when he says uh, Europe has philosophy, other places have great bodies of thought, but not philosophy. And that sentence is haunting because it means that other places aren't allowed to have philosophy, or if they have it, it's the European philosophy they're using. And that creates again the West versus non-West dynamic and the asymmetry from scratch. So that's the Derridean issue that I'm dealing with.
And do you find the logocentrism proposal a useful framework, or are you
I
critical
think
of it?
that's the good stuff. I think
That's
that's
the
the
good
stuff
stuff.
that shows the limits. That's where he's good at decentering. My question is the limits of how that decentering goes.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to put it is the 600 or so miles that separates Athens and Jerusalem, because
Mm.
that's the paradigm that he uses with Jew Greek and Greek Jew, where it says that everything happens between Athens and Jerusalem. And that's a very limiting geographical space, especially when the Jerusalem he's talking about is not East Jerusalem. It's
Mm.
Jerusalem that's clearly Judeo Christian. And he talks about how his own finitude, he uses the Heideggerian thrownness. He said, I happen to be thrown in the Judeo Christian tradition. Well, that's lovely for him, but how about the rest of us who don't
Right.
have that thrownness? Like, what does that
Yeah.
mean for philosophy? What does it mean for deconstruction?
Yeah. I'll be really excited to sort of examine Jones. One of the things that interests me the most about clouds so far, as I'm reading through it, is the framework and the rapprochement between Islam and psychoanalysis.
Yes.
This wider claim that there is this great rapprochement at
Mhm.
an ontological level. That Islam is like almost like in the same way that Lacan says Pascal invented the object A. She's
Yeah.
almost saying, well, Islam had a premonition of the unconscious or something like this, right? Uh,
It
very,
is
very
very,
interesting. Well, it's refreshing, right? Because
very
you,
open.
well, usually these Lacanians, they have a very particular Orientalist political agenda on
Thank
Islam.
you.
Right,
Thank you.
right,
Yep.
right. So she's not, as far as I can tell, I need to check the citations. She's not taking the Ben Slama model,
I
right?
don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I'm reading through that stuff too, and she's meticulous as hell. So I can't wait to talk to her about this
yeah.
argument. She's incredible.
Okay, comrades. Well, thank you, Farhang, for this
My pleasure.
fabulous intervention, this conversation. Thank you all for being a part of this. I think we'll close,
Yeah.
and we'll see everyone. Is it next? Is it next week or the week after? I'm going to give the
Next week,
precise.
it's right. The 10th.
The 13th. I
Oh
think it's
yeah,
the
so it's
13th.
next Wednesday.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. All the best. Until next time.
Absolutely.
All the
Bye-bye.
best.